Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that takes your sources and, well, tries to cut through the noise. Today, we've got a really interesting one, a question that keeps popping up in headlines, causing a lot of confusion. Does America control Israel? Or is it the other way around? Our main source for this deep dive is an insightful blog post by Simon Dixon. It reflects on one of his BitcoinHardTalk episodes, number 87, I think. And he suggests, if you just watch the news, you might think one thing. But if you really follow the money, well, that tells a very different story.
Right. And what's really fascinating is how Dixon connects things you might not normally put together, like shifts in Bitcoin, the bigger macroeconomic picture, and geopolitics. He makes the case that by tracking those financial flows, you can actually see who's really pulling the strings behind the scenes, get past the surface stuff. And Dixon, well, he's known for this kind of analysis. He's a big name in Bitcoin, alternative finance. Someone who's called some major financial shifts pretty accurately before. So his take here is definitely worth exploring.
Okay, so this idea of following the money showing a different picture. How exactly does Dixon use Bitcoin's network signal specifically to uncover these, let's say, deeper geopolitical narratives?
Well, the source gets quite specific there. It talks about how Bitcoin's own network activity can maybe signal global events. For instance, Dixon points to this huge drop, like 25%, in the global Bitcoin hash rate.
Hash rate, that's the computing power securing the network, right? Massive amounts.
Exactly. We're talking about 200x hashes per second going offline. And he notes this drop lined up almost perfectly with the news reports about U.S. strikes on Iran's nuclear facilities.
That's quite a connection to make. So how does the recovery of that hash rate lead him to think it was, as you said, theater instead of a real attack?
Yeah, it's a bold claim. So, okay, some of that hash rate drop was apparently due to a heat wave in Texas, which does happen. But Dixon argues the speed of the recovery suggests Iran's actual share of the global hash rate is way bigger than people think, like much bigger than official estimates, which implies, they've potentially been mining Bitcoin on a national scale for years.
Okay.
And so this quick bounce back for Dixon indicates those initial strikes weren't a crippling blow, more like choreographed theater, as he puts it. He also ties this into how the U.S. is pushing its digital asset policies. You've got the Genius Act for stablecoins passed.
Right.
And this big crypto market structure bill is apparently coming. And the catch, he says, seems to be that only custodied crypto qualifies for certain things, like maybe mortgage eligibility.
Custodied meaning held by someone else, not you directly in self-custody.
Exactly, which he basically calls a honey trap. You give up control for convenience or integration.
Okay, so connecting this back. If managing America's massive national debt is sort of the hidden driver here, like the source suggests, how does that link up with this geopolitical theater, this Iran situation, for instance?
Right. So zooming out to the bigger picture, Dixon's argument is that this huge U.S. debt is really central to a lot of these recent events, both geopolitical and financial. You saw the Federal Reserve holding interest rates steady, for example. But the deeper story, according to the source, is this plan to basically roll over that massive debt using a whole new financial system, one built around stablecoins.
Stablecoins backed by U.S. debt?
That seems to be the idea he's putting forward. He even suggests that maybe Trump's strategy for handling the debt involves getting a compliant Fed chair in place, forcing rates lower, and then using these new stablecoins backed by U.S. treasuries to essentially create a captive market, forcing demand for that debt.
And this perspective, focusing on these kind of hidden financial gears, it also changes how we see Bitcoin itself on the world stage, doesn't it? Our source mentions the IMF now officially calls Bitcoin a capital asset. That's a big deal, putting it alongside land, gold, recognizing its decentralized nature. And we're even hearing reports like Bhutan apparently holding a significant chunk of their GDP in Bitcoin from national mining.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really tangled. Dixon argues that even things like Trump's trade deal with China, which seemed good for markets short term, actually, maybe ironically, pushed nations towards alternatives like the BRICS group, creating these lasting shifts in global economic power. And he points to classic signs of market manipulation, too, like with oil, Iran votes to close the Strait of Hormuz, prices jump up, but then they crash 8%, even after Iran fires rockets at a U.S. base. He says the market just knew. It knew it was theater.
Because a real conflict would likely send prices soaring, not crashing.
Precisely. And meanwhile, you see BRIC nations trading more and more amongst themselves, over $1 trillion now, without using the U.S. dollar. Dixon sees this as all by design, sort of a holding pattern until some kind of global monetary reset happens.
Okay, so let's circle back to that original provocative question. Does Israel control America, or does America control Israel? What's Dixon's take based on this analysis?
Well, according to our source, Simon Dixon is pretty definitive. He says, no, Israel does not control America. Instead, he posits Israel functions more like a U.S. colony, a strategic tool, part of what he calls a proof of weapons network.
A proof of weapons network. What does that mean exactly?
It seems to mean a way for the U.S. to project power, test military tech, maybe exert influence, but with a layer of plausible deniability, using Israel as a proxy, essentially.
And he connects this to the recent conflict.
Yes, very directly. Dixon argues the recent 12-day war, as he termed it, wasn't spontaneous. He sees it as almost like a pre-scripted 5-act play.
A play designed to do what?
Designed, in his view, to reset the world order, to strategically weaken regional powers, not through genuine all-out war, but through this kind of controlled, choreographed conflict. The goal, he argues, wasn't military victory in the traditional sense, but setting the stage for major financial moves, like economic vassalization, he calls it, basically weakening countries economically.
Making them dependent, maybe preparing their assets for cheap acquisition later.
Exactly. Preparing assets for distressed acquisition by financial powers. He thinks the U.S. actions, like bombing evacuated Iranian sites, were largely symbolic, for the media, for optics. And the end game, he suggests, is a negotiated exit for the U.S. military-industrial complex from the Middle East, making way for the financial-industrial complex to take over.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, what does this all mean for you listening in? Our source, Simon Dixon, paints this picture of a world where market stability, these isolated conflicts, even regulation, it's all potentially part of a design. And this new financial system is being rolled out using these full reserve stablecoins backed by sovereign debt. And even Bitcoin, the supposed alternative, could be co-opted if you don't hold it yourself in self-custody.
Yeah, it really forces you to ask some tough questions about your own financial sovereignty, doesn't it? If the dollar system is being, re-engineered and wars are potentially being monetized in this way, and Bitcoin is pitched as this neutral asset they can't just print or sanction, what does it really mean for your independence when, as Dixon puts it, stability is the story they sell you right before they pull the plug?
A lot to think about there. We hope this deep dive into Dixon's perspective has given you some food for thought, maybe sparked a few aha moments. Until next time, keep digging deeper and seeking out those connections.